This is our Briggs & Stratton 990cc engine, and today we're going to be taking apart the engine cover, gas tank, and air filter. To begin with, you remove the two screws on the top of the engine cover and remove the engine cover, being careful not to damage the pull cord as you remove it. You are going to use an 8mm socket to remove the 3 bolts on the top of the gas tank. There's also a bolt on the side that goes down into the engine block that you have to remove.
And that's a 10mm.
Alright, then we're doing the gas tank. Gets pulled. That's fun. And you have to slide off the fuel line. Being careful if there's any fuel to drain, you have a receptacle ready. In this case, there was none. Next, we have the air filter, which is mounted here. There's a slotted screwdriver that you have to remove the housing, or the cover, which is like that. And the housing holds the air filter. This prevents particles from getting into the carburetor. It needs to be cleaned periodically. This one's pretty clean, and it also allows sufficient air flow. And then we're going to flip it over and do the oil plug. You grab your socket, and depending on how much room do you work with, you can just use the end of the socket, or if you want to use an extension to get in there, you can use an extension. Looks like we don't have enough room for the extension. And you also want to have something ready to catch the oil. This one has already been drained, so there won't be any oil coming out. Next, we're going to take off the air filter housing. It also contains the throttle here and your governor linkage here. The throttle has 2 bolts that are kind of hard to get to. There and there. And those are 8mm as well.
And you can see that it connects in the back, this little hose right here, and we have to make sure that we bring the cover off. Okay, so now we take this hose off.
Yep, you need pliers for that.
And then we take off the carburetor next, which is pretty tricky. There's a bolt here that needs to come out and a bolt under here that needs to come out. So it's a little awkward.
And we're going to use the 10mm on that.
And it's easier to use an extension on this one. Okay, so the carburetor's connected to the governor on this little plastic piece, and you have to kind of twist the carburetor so that the plastic comes off the little hook at the bottom.
Next comes the throttle mounting bracket, but at this point you can see where the carburetor sends the air-fuel mixture into the air intake manifold. You'll need 2 bolts to be removed here and here. And when you do end up removing it, you have to be careful not to bend this governor linkage cable or the throttle, as they are kind of fragile. So at this point, you're going to unhook the throttle spring on the end of coil dent, and that way you can remove
So it came off right here.
the carburetor mounting plate, but there's also a kill switch cable that needs to be unhooked as well.
Yep, and it's hooked up right here, and all you have to do is press the little lever and the end of the wire will come out.
Next, we're going to remove the engine cover, as well as the dipstick. So there are several bolts that need to be removed. Here, here. The dipstick has a bolt here. It's actually just a O-ring and a press fit into the crankcase. That should just pop out. And then there's also bolts here and here that need to be removed. And those are the 10 millimeters.
Okay, so once you have the engine cover unscrewed and the dipstick unscrewed, you're ready to take it apart. So your dipstick just pops out like that. And then the cover, if you got all 4 of the screws, is loose to come up.
Alright, so looking down on the top of the engine, you can now see several key elements. First, the magneto is the part that's attached to the crankshaft and has magnets on one side. It's out of focus. Yep, and one side's magnetized. And as it rotates, it spins past the coil, which is this piece, which has iron and copper wires in it. That interaction between the magnet and the armature of the coil sends electricity and a spark down to the spark plug. Here. Attached to the coil are a couple of wires that are used to disengage the coil when we want the engine to stop. One is connected to the emergency stop, which also mechanically stops the engine like that, and when it does, it also shorts the coil. And then this one was connected to the throttle, which we removed earlier. To remove the coil, you're going to take a smaller socket and remove these 2.
So this screwdriver here, this tool is what fits on these bolts. And then it comes right out. And it's attached to the spark plug on the other end. You can see maybe a little bit.
Yeah, you can pop that wire right off.
Yep.
And you use a special spark plug socket. Here you can see there's a very tiny gap between the anode and the cathode of the spark plug. And the emergency stop has a very, very, very strong spring and 2 bolts that need to be removed.
That claims that his pistol on top, the same thing.
Pops off?
Yep, comes right off.
Nice. Then we've got the muffler and the PVC breather. The muffler has 2 large bolts that are here and here. The PVC breather is behind it. And then this is the intake manifold, which takes gas from the carburetor, gas and fuel mixture from the carburetor, and sends it down into the cylinder. So I think we need a 10 millimeter, no, 11, maybe 12.
11.
11 for the muffler, 10 for the PVC breather,
Battery's flashing orange, does that mean you need to hook up the AC?
and then the this thing. The intake manifold has a small black plastic piece that directs the fuel down into the cylinder. It's very easy to lose, so you want to be careful of not losing that piece. Fits in there just like that. Next, we are going to remove the PVC breather, which is right here, and this sends back pressure from the crankcase all the way through back into the air intake to help speed the fuel or air into the carburetor. Inside the PVC breather, you can begin to see the valves. These are connected from the these are called the push rods on the inside of the valve, and then the springs help to return the valves to the original position. The cam gear is located inside the crankcase over here, and then the valves are going to be located in here, which we can see when we remove the cylinder head, which we will do next. In order to remove that, we need to remove these 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8 bolts. And these are just hand tightened, but when you do take them out and put them back in for real, you're going to want to make sure they're nice and snug. Alright, so the cylinder head pops off, and you got your gasket here, which needs to be lined up when you put it back in. This is the head of the cylinder. Here are your exhaust valve and your intake valve. And if you look at the back side of the cylinder head, you can see how the valves can direct gasoline air in and then out back to the exhaust valve. As you rotate the magneto, you can see the cylinder comes in and out, and there are precise times at which the intake and exhaust valve must open. As the magneto passes by, this is the magneto, right where the coil was, the spark plug would fire. Then the power stroke occurs where the gasoline air vapor mixture ignites and pushes down. That's called the power stroke. After the power stroke, as the piston returns back, the exhaust valve opens and the exhaust can exit through the muffler. After the exhaust stroke, the intake valve must open here, and when the intake valve opens, the air-fuel mixture that has not been burnt is drawn in on the intake stroke. At the end of that stroke, the next stroke is the compression stroke, in which the gasoline and air mixture is compressed, and at that point, the magneto has spun all the way around once again, and the spark plug should fire, causing an explosion and the power stroke to happen again. And this all happens very, very quickly. Yeah. So you're going to flip your engine over. and remove the crankcase cover by removing bolts here, 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 and here. Now sometimes this may come off easily, but other times it may not. There's a nice little place here that you can tap on to slide it up, and then there's also one here that you can tap on to slide it up. So you just kind of pop it up. And on the inside you can see all of the internal mechanisms of the internal combustion engine. We have the oil slinger here, which, if you can imagine the crankcase being upside down, the oil would pool, and as this engine rotates, it's going to cause the oil slinger to also rotate and sling the oil around to lubricate everything properly. This device right here works as a centripetally flung out governor. So as the engine is idle, this push gets pushed in, and as it spins, it pushes out. So the faster it goes, the further out it pushes on this linkage, which is the governor linkage, which goes back to the throttle to regulate the air-fuel intake. This is the oil slinger and governor. This is the governor linkage. This gear right here is the cam gear, and there is a specific orientation that the cam gear needs to be in order to push and open and close the valves at the correct time. This timing gear here has a little indicator that needs to line up with the timing gear on the cam gear. Alright, so here's the cam gear, and that slides out, and it's called a cam gear because of these two cams. As it rotates in a specific timing, these little bumps on this shaft push on these two valves. One of these is the intake valve, one of them is the exhaust valve. The timing gear can be slid off the crankshaft, and there is a keyway that you can see that has to slide into a groove on the crankshaft so that it is properly timed. If you don't do it in the right way, it's going to ride up and not seat properly. The push rod can just pop right out. These are the same for each one, doesn't really matter which one goes in where. Next comes the counterweight, which is attached to the crankshaft and the piston. In order to get these, we have to go deep in there and get a wrench down in there. So that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. I think it's the 8mm. All right, so there's a long one and a short one. The long one goes on the inside. One tooth removing now, and the short one goes on the far side. All right, so there's a little bracket that comes off that clamps around the crankshaft, and then there's one side that has a groove in it, and that matches up with the groove on the other side of the connecting rod. The whole engine can then be, the crankcase can be rotated, and you can push and pull the piston out of the cylinder. The springs are very difficult to get back in, and we're going to get a tool that's going to come around and squeeze them together so that we can slide it back in without damaging or scoring the edge of the cylinder. So there are the rings, and they get squeezed together and slid back in through the cylinder. And when you do that, you have to make sure that the piston is rotated in the correct orientation so that you can get the clamping back on.